Hello, welcome to my channel. Today you will get to hear 12 scary crime stories. So let's get started.
Story 1. The Watcher in the Walls. The scratching in the walls started subtly, a faint, intermittent rasping that I initially dismissed as old plumbing or mischievous squirrels. But as the days bled into weeks, the scratching grew more persistent, more deliberate. It seemed to follow me from room to room, a phantom presence lurking just beyond my perception. I live alone in a rambling Victorian house perched atop a windswept hill. It's a beautiful old place, steeped in history, but its isolation has begun to weigh on me. The nearest neighbor is miles away, and the silence here is so profound it's almost deafening. The scratching, however, is anything but silent. It's a constant, insidious reminder that I'm not alone. I've called in exterminators, contractors, even paranormal investigators, but no one can find any evidence of an intruder. They all look at me with pity in their eyes, the same way they looked at my mother when she started talking to the shadow people. I know they think I'm crazy, but I'm not. I'm perfectly sane. It's just that sometimes, in the dead of night, I see a fleeting shadow dart across the periphery of my vision. A tall, gaunt figure with eyes that burn like embers. The scratching is getting louder now, more insistent. I can feel it vibrating through the floorboards, crawling up my legs. I press my ear against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who's there?" I whisper. A long, guttural sigh seems to emanate from the wall itself, sending a shiver down my spine. "You can't hide forever," a voice rasps. I stumble back, my breath catching in my throat. The voice, it sounded so familiar. The scratching in the walls intensifies, morphing into a frantic clawing. I scream, my voice echoing through the empty house. The walls seem to be closing in on me, suffocating me. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the scratching stops. The silence returns, heavier and more oppressive than before. I stood there, trembling, my mind reeling. I'm not crazy. I know I'm not. But then who is scratching in the walls? Here's the twist. The victim is suffering from severe dissociative identity disorder. The watcher in the walls is a manifestation of their own repressed trauma, a splintered personality clawing its way to the surface. This brings us to the climax. The victim, in a fit of madness, tears down the walls of their house, only to find nothing there. The realization that the watcher is a part of them leads to a complete mental breakdown. Story 2. The Gaslight Sonata. The music started a few weeks after I moved into the apartment. A haunting piano sonata that drifted through the walls at odd hours, its melancholic melody seeping into my dreams. At first, I found it strangely comforting, a lullaby that eased my loneliness in this unfamiliar city. But as the days turned into weeks, the music became more intrusive, more insidious. It would start in the dead of night, jolting me awake with its mournful strains. I tried to find the source, knocking on neighbors' doors, even venturing into the building's dusty attic, but to no avail. No one else seemed to hear the music. My husband Mark dismissed it as my imagination. "You're just stressed," he'd say, his voice laced with a patronizing concern that made my skin crawl. "It's all in your head." But I knew I wasn't imagining it. The music was real. It was driving me mad. One night, I woke to the sound of the sonata reaching a fever pitch. The notes crashed and soared, filling the room with an almost tangible presence. I could feel the vibrations in my bones, the melody pulsing through my veins. Driven to the brink, I grabbed a vase and hurled it against the wall, the porcelain shattering into 1,000 pieces. The music abruptly stopped. Mark rushed into the room, his face creased with worry. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice strained. "The music," I gasped, pointing at the wall. "It's finally stopped." He looked at me with a mixture of pity and exasperation. "There's no music, Sarah," he said gently. "You need to rest." I stared at him, my blood running cold. He was lying. I could see it in his eyes. He knew about the music. He was the one playing it. Here is the twist. Mark is gaslighting Sarah, using the music to manipulate her and make her doubt her sanity. He has installed hidden speakers in the apartment and plays the Sonata to control her emotions and isolate her from the outside world. This brings us to the climax. Sarah discovers Mark's elaborate setup and confronts him. In a fit of rage, he confesses to his manipulation, revealing a deep-seated resentment towards her success and independence. Sarah, empowered by the truth, fights back and escapes his clutches. Story 3: The Phantom Hitchhiker. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the highway into a shimmering ribbon of black. I was driving home from a late-night shift at the hospital, my mind still reeling from the horrors I'd witnessed that day. As I rounded a bend, I saw a figure standing on the shoulder of the road, their thumb outstretched in the classic hitchhiking pose. It was a young woman, her face obscured by a rain-soaked hood. Something about her tugged at my heartstrings. Maybe it was the vulnerability in her stance, or the way she shivered in the cold. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. She slid into the passenger seat, her damp clothes releasing a musty odor that mingled with the scent of antiseptic clinging to my scrubs. She didn't speak, just stared straight ahead, her eyes fixed on the road. I tried to make small talk, asking her name, where she was headed, but she remained silent. Her silence was unnerving, but I chalked it up to shock or exhaustion. As I drove, I noticed a strange detail. Her hands resting on her lap were eerily pale, almost translucent. I could see the faint outline of bones beneath the skin. A shiver ran down my spine. I glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror, but her face was still hidden in the shadows of her hood. Suddenly, she turned her head and met my gaze. Her eyes were wide and vacant, like those of a corpse. I gasped, slamming on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt, the tires screaming against the wet asphalt. I turned to look at her, but the passenger seat was empty. There was no sign of her anywhere. Here is the twist. The hitchhiker is the ghost of a young woman who died in a car accident on that very stretch of highway years ago. The narrator, a doctor who worked on her case, is subconsciously drawn to her spirit, reliving the trauma of her death. This brings us to the climax. The narrator returns to the hospital the next day, only to find the hitchhiker's name on the list of patients admitted that night. The realization that she is treating the ghost of her former patient sends her into a spiral of guilt and despair. Story 4: The Collector. The antique shop was tucked away in a shadowy alley, its dusty windows displaying a macabre assortment of curiosities. I was drawn to it like a moth to a flame, my curiosity piqued by the strange aura that seemed to emanate from within. The shopkeeper was an elderly man with a hawk-like gaze and a disconcerting smile. He watched me intently as I browsed the shelves, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. My attention was drawn to a peculiar object, a porcelain doll with piercing blue eyes and a disturbingly lifelike expression. I picked it up, feeling a strange connection to it, as if it were calling out to me. The shopkeeper chuckled. "That's a special one," he said, his voice raspy and low. "She has a way of finding her way into people's hearts." I bought the doll, ignoring the unease that gnawed at my gut. I placed it on my bedside table, its unblinking eyes staring into mine as I drifted off to sleep. That night, I had a vivid dream. I was in a dark, suffocating room, surrounded by shelves filled with porcelain dolls. Their eyes followed my every move, their painted smiles mocking my fear. I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The doll was gone. I searched the apartment, but it was nowhere to be found. Then I heard a faint giggle coming from the closet. I cautiously opened the door, my breath catching in my throat. The doll was sitting on the floor, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its blue eyes gleaming in the darkness. Here's the twist. The doll is possessed by the spirit of a young girl who was murdered by the shopkeeper years ago. He collects souls, trapping them in porcelain dolls and feeding off their energy. This brings us to the climax. The narrator discovers the shopkeeper's dark secret and becomes his next target. The dolls come to life, their vacant eyes burning with malevolent intent as they close in on the terrified narrator. Story 5, The Doppelganger. It started with a fleeting glimpse in a crowded subway car. A woman who looked exactly like me, down to the smallest detail. I dismissed it as a coincidence, a trick of the light. But the sightings became more frequent, more unsettling. I'd see her everywhere, in the reflection of shop windows, across busy streets, even in my own apartment building. She'd always be there, watching me with an enigmatic smile playing on her lips. My friends and family brushed it off as paranoia, but I knew something was wrong. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. This woman was a doppelganger, a sinister reflection of myself. The encounters grew bolder. She started showing up at my workplace, talking to my colleagues, even attending my social gatherings. People were confused, their faces etched with uncertainty as they tried to distinguish between us. I felt my identity slipping away, my sense of self dissolving into a hall of mirrors. Who was I? Was I the original, or was she? One night I confronted her in a deserted alleyway. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. She smiled, her eyes gleaming with malice. "I'm you," she replied, her voice a chilling echo of my own. But better, here's the twist. The doppelganger is a manifestation of the narrator's repressed desires and dark impulses. She represents the person the narrator could have become if she had embraced her darker side. This brings us to the climax. The doppelganger attempts to take over the narrator's life, assuming her identity and manipulating those around her. The narrator must fight to reclaim her life and confront the darkness within herself. Story 6, The Haunting of Blackwood Manor. The old house loomed over me like a malevolent specter, its Gothic architecture casting long, eerie shadows across the overgrown lawn. I had inherited Blackwood Manor from a distant relative, a reclusive woman rumored to have been insane. Despite the unsettling stories surrounding the house, I was determined to restore it to its former glory. I hired a team of contractors and set about transforming the dilapidated mansion into a livable home. But as the renovations progressed, strange things started to happen. Tools would go missing, furniture would inexplicably move, and whispers seemed to echo through the empty corridors. I tried to ignore the unsettling occurrences, attributing them to overactive imaginations and creaky floorboards. But the incidents grew more frequent, more disturbing. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I crept out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and followed the sound to the attic door. The door creaked open, revealing a pitch-black room. I fumbled for the light switch, my hand trembling. The light flickered on, illuminating a scene that sent a chill down my spine. A woman in a white gown stood in the center of the room, her back to me. Her long black hair cascaded down her back, obscuring her face. I gasped, my voice catching in my throat. The woman slowly turned, her pale face contorted in a horrifying grimace. Her eyes were hollow sockets, her mouth a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth. I screamed, stumbling back in terror. The woman lunged at me, her icy fingers reaching for my throat. Here is the twist. The narrator is not haunted by the ghost of the previous owner. but by their own guilt and repressed memories. The woman in white is a manifestation of their own dark past, a past they have tried to bury within the walls of Blackwood Manor. This brings us to the climax. The narrator discovers a hidden room in the attic, containing evidence of a terrible crime they committed years ago. The realization of their own culpability leads to a mental breakdown, blurring the lines between reality and delusion. Story 7, The Man in the Mirror. The face in the mirror wasn't mine. It was a subtle difference, a slight alteration in the curve of the lips, a flicker of something sinister in the eyes, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but the face remained. It stared back at me with an unnerving intensity, its expression a mockery of my own. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a fleeting hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But the face persisted, haunting my every reflection. It started to appear in other reflective surfaces, shop windows, car windshields, even the polished surface of my coffee table. Everywhere I looked, the distorted face leered back at me, its eyes boring into my soul. I became obsessed with mirrors, scrutinizing my reflection for any sign of the imposter. I avoided looking at myself, fearing what I might see. One day I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a hammer and smashed every mirror in my apartment, the shards scattering across the floor like glittering tears. But the face didn't disappear. It remained etched in my mind, a constant reminder of the fractured reality I was trapped in. Here's the twist. The man in the mirror is a physical manifestation of the narrator's growing paranoia and self-loathing. He represents the narrator's fear of losing control, of succumbing to the darkness within. This brings us to the climax. The narrator, driven to the brink of madness, confronts the man in the mirror, only to realize that he is a part of himself. The acceptance of his own dark side leads to a chilling transformation, blurring the lines between reality and reflection. Story 8, The Whispering Walls. The whispers started subtly, a faint murmur that I initially dismissed as the creaking of the old house settling. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, weaving tales of tragedy and despair. I tried to ignore them, but the whispers were relentless. They followed me from room to room, their voices weaving a tapestry of paranoia and dread. I started to see shadows lurking in the corners of my vision, fleeting figures that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The house felt alive, its every creak and groan a whispered threat. One night, the whispers reached a fever pitch. They swirled around me, their voices morphing into a cacophony of screams and pleas. I covered my ears, trying to block out the horrifying sounds, but they seeped into my consciousness, poisoning my thoughts. Driven to the brink, I grabbed a knife and plunged it into the wall, hoping to silence the voices that tormented me. But the whispers only grew louder, their voices laced with mockery and malice. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The walls were closing in on me, suffocating me with their whispers of madness. Here's the twist. The whispers are not supernatural in origin, but are instead the product of the narrator's own fractured psyche. They are the voices of their past traumas and repressed memories, clawing their way to the surface. This brings us to the climax. The narrator, consumed by paranoia and delusion, sets fire to the house in a desperate attempt to silence the voices. As the flames engulf the building, the whispers finally cease, leaving the narrator in a state of blissful silence. Story 9, The Shadow Stalker. It started with a feeling of being watched, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a fleeting shadow that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I dismissed it as paranoia, a byproduct of the stress and isolation of city life. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. I started to notice subtle signs of a stalker. Misplaced items, strange phone calls, even the faint scent of a particular cologne lingering in my apartment. I reported my concerns to the police, but they found no evidence of foul play. They chalked it up to an overactive imagination, a case of nerves. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. The stalker was real. I could feel their presence lurking in the shadows, their eyes watching my every move. One night I woke to the sound of breaking glass. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw a figure silhouetted against the moonlight streaming through the window. The figure moved closer, its features obscured by the darkness. I reached for the phone, my fingers trembling, but it was too late. The figure lunged at me, its hands reaching for my throat. I screamed, struggling against its grasp, but it was too strong. Here is the twist. The stalker is not a stranger, but someone the narrator knows intimately. It is a person they trust, a person who has been manipulating them and gaslighting them for months. This brings us to the climax. The stalker's identity is revealed in a shocking confrontation, shattering the narrator's sense of reality and leaving them questioning everything they thought they knew. Story 10, The Locked Door. Everyone warned me about the old boarding house on Bramble Lane. Too cheap to be true, they said, but cheap rent was exactly what I needed. Besides, the landlady, Mrs. Grayson, seemed nice enough. She showed me the room on the second floor and gave me one rule: never open the locked door at the end of the hall. I laughed it off, assuming it was a storage closet or some other mundane explanation. But as the weeks passed, my curiosity grew. The door was heavy, painted a deep, peeling red, with an ornate brass handle that gleamed despite the house's general state of disrepair. At night I'd hear faint noises from behind it, a rhythmic tapping, soft murmurs. It was probably just the pipes, I told myself. But the sounds continued, growing louder, more insistent. One night I couldn't resist any longer. Armed with a bobby pin and a flashlight, I knelt before the door and picked the lock. It was easier than I expected, the lock clicking open with a satisfying sound. My heart raced as I pushed the door open. Inside was a room perfectly preserved, as if frozen in time. A child's room with a small bed, a wooden rocking horse, and a collection of dusty toys scattered across the floor. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the walls were covered in faint scratches, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. In the corner stood a mirror, its surface warped and cloudy. I stepped closer, drawn to it despite the unease coiling in my stomach. When I looked into the mirror, I didn't see my reflection. Instead, I saw a young boy, his face pale and hollow, his eyes wide with terror. He opened his mouth as if to scream, but no sound came out. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and the door slammed shut behind me. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Help me!" the boy whispered, his voice barely audible. He pressed his hands against the glass, and I realized with dawning horror that the scratches on the walls matched his movements. I banged on the door, screaming for Mrs. Grayson, for anyone. Finally, the door flew open, and I collapsed into the hallway. Mrs. Grayson stood there, her face pale but calm. "I warned you," she said softly. "Now you're his replacement." I tried to run, but the hallway stretched endlessly, the walls closing in. The last thing I remember is the boy's reflection reaching through the mirror, pulling me inside. Now, I'm trapped, watching as Mrs. Grayson rents the room to someone new. Story 11, The Disappearing Roommate. It all started when Emily moved in. She answered my ad for a roommate, and everything seemed fine at first. She was paid her share of the rent on time. But after a few weeks, I began to notice strange things. Sometimes when I came home from work, the apartment felt different. The air would be heavy, the lights dimmed, and a faint, unfamiliar scent lingered. Emily's door was always closed, but I'd hear murmurs from inside, like she was talking to someone. One night I knocked. "Everything okay?" I asked. The murmurs stopped. "Fine," she said through the door, her voice flat. Then her belongings started disappearing. First, the framed photo she kept on the coffee table. Next, the mug she always used. One by one, her things vanished, until it was as if she'd never been there. I confronted her about it. "I don't need those things anymore," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eye. One morning, I woke to find her bedroom door wide open. The room was completely empty. No furniture, no clothes, not even a stray hairpin. I called her cell, but it went straight to voicemail. Her name wasn't on the lease, so the landlord couldn't help me. It was like she'd been erased. Weeks passed, and I tried to move on. But every so often I'd catch glimpses of her in the corner of my eye, standing in the shadows. And when I slept, I'd dream of her voice whispering, "You should have left too." Last night, I found a note on my bedside table. "It's your turn now." This morning, my reflection wasn't in the mirror. Story 12, The Vanishing Street. For years, I'd heard rumors about Hollow Street. People said it wasn't on any map, that it appeared only to those who needed it. The desperate, the lost, the broken. I never believed in such nonsense until the night I found it. I'd been wandering aimlessly, reeling from a fight with my girlfriend. Rain pelted down as I turned a corner and found myself on a narrow cobblestone street. The buildings were old, their windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. A sign above one door read "Sanctuary." Inside, the air was thick with the scent of lavender and something metallic. A woman behind the counter greeted me with a knowing smile. "Welcome, you've come to the right place." I stayed the night in one of their rooms, comforted by the quiet and the solitude. But when I woke, the street was gone. My room was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. My phone's GPS showed I was miles from where I'd started. Since then, I've been obsessed with finding it again. In disappointment. And every night I dream of that street, its warm lights flickering and the woman whispering, "You can't escape."
Thank you for joining me for tonight's story. I always appreciate you taking the time to listen. I hope you sleep soundly. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more horror bedtime stories.